Hey everybody. So in this video, I'm going to cover the grammar for this week, which is on commas, apostrophes, and capitalization. So, commas is the one here that, I think is the most complicated and tends to give people the most trouble because there's a lot of rules for using commas, and there's a little bit of a gray area sometimes in terms of using commas because the comma rules sometimes are a little flexible. Um, one of the things that I often hear from students when I ask them, when are you supposed to use a comma in a sentence? And is they tell me that you use a comma because there's a pause in the sentence, all right? Which is how it's often taught, to students who are just learning about commas. It's not entirely true in writing, though. So um, I, it's more helpful to think about a comma in writing as a something that helps the reader to organize the ideas in the sentence, right? And helps the reader avoid confusion in the sentence. So yeah, when you're actually speaking and reading a sentence, you're likely to pause in certain places. But the reason why you're pausing is something specific. It's not necessarily that you're pausing for emphasis, for example. But the comma is there to to organize the information for the reader. All right, and to prevent misreading. Okay, so what I've done is I've taken I've taken certain comma rules that I found on the internet, and I've put them into what I'm calling the 10 commandments of commas. All right, so these are 10 rules that you should be familiar with in your comma usage, and um, you should try to follow when you're using commas in your writing. All right, and the first three are fairly common. Okay, these are three rules that you should have some familiarity with. All right. The first one, just because we've covered it before in this class, use commas to separate independent clauses when they're joined by any of the seven coordinating conjunctions. Okay, those are the fanboys. All right, so if it's a compound sentence with a conjunction, then you should have a comma before the conjunction. The game was over, comma, but the crowd refused to leave. The second example is when you have an introductory clause, phrase, or words that come before the main clause. Right? So if I say, while I was eating, comma, the cat scratched at the door. All right. And what this comma is really doing is it's giving a signal to the reader that the main idea of the sentence is about to begin. Right, we're done with the introductory part of the sentence and now we're getting to the main idea. It can also prevent misreading too. So, like in this example, if I get rid of the comma, then the sentence begins while I was eating the cat, and you know, the reader is likely at that point to be, vaguely horrified and have to stop and reread the sentence to figure out exactly what is going on, right? So that comma prevents that potential for misreading, that potential for confusion. Okay. Um, there are times where you can drop the comma after the introductory part of the sentence. But it's really only situations where you have a sentence that already contains a lot of commas. And this is, uh, and this is one thing that's true about commas, is that if you have too many commas in a sentence, that can also be confusing, right? So the introductory clause, phrase, or words, if in a sentence like this, you want to have a comma after them, okay? But if you have a sentence that already contains a lot of commas, then you can actually leave that one out, right? If you feel like it's making the sentence too choppy or too confusing. Um, but Compound sentences like number one, you don't ever want to leave that comma out. And then for number three, you don't ever want to leave these commas out. So if you have a list, all right, three or more words, phrases, or clauses written in a series. Okay, the Constitution establishes the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. And always put that comma before the final and in a list. All right. Some rule books tell you it's optional. I'm going to tell you just to do it because there are situations where leaving that and out can create confusion for the reader. Okay, so it's always better just to keep it in. I think it makes the list actually look a little cleaner than when you leave it out. All right. So the next rule is a little more involved. Okay, so I'm going to spend a little more time on it and give you an exercise to do on it. So this one says use a pair of commas in the middle of a sentence to set off clauses, phrases, and words that are not essential to the meaning of the sentence. Okay, and again, this is this is something that I covered in a prior video. The difference between a clause and a phrase is that a clause contains a subject and a verb, and a phrase does not. All right. Um, so if you have a clause, phrase, or words that are not essential to the meaning of the sentence, then you want to separate with commas from the rest of the sentence. All right. So if it's in the middle of the sentence, you want to have a comma before the non-essential part or the non-essential element and a comma after it. Okay, so in this example, that Tuesday, which happens to be my birthday, is the only day when I'm available to meet. Okay, so the main idea is that Tuesday is the only day when I am available to meet. I'm just adding for your, for your reference or for your knowledge that it also happens to be my birthday. All right, but that part of the sentence is not essential to the main point. Okay, which is that Tuesday is the only day I can meet. So I'm going to put commas around that. All right, and those commas are a signal to the reader that this clause, and it is a clause because it has a verb happens, and the subject is which. This clause is not the main point. It's not essential to the main point I'm trying to make. So this is a case where the commas are there to help us organize the information. Okay. Now, one way to keep track of whether a clause is essential or non-essential is whether it begins with that or which. Okay, so clauses that begin with which, like which happens to be my birthday, are not essential. Okay, clauses that begin with that are essential. Okay, so another way to think about that is if you have the word which in a sentence, you're going to have a comma before the word which. Okay, if it comes in the middle of a sentence, and probably a comma that comes at the end of the clause as well. Okay, but if you have the word that in the middle of the sentence, you're not going to put a comma before the word that, or at least not usually. Okay, so to give you some examples, okay, if I say the book that I borrowed from you is excellent, right? You're not going to put commas around that I borrowed from you because the word that is telling us that this information is essential to the meaning of the sentence. Okay. So in other words, this clause that I borrowed from you is there to let us know exactly which book you're talking about. All right. Whereas if I said this book, which I borrowed from you, is excellent. Okay. Changing that to which makes it a non-essential phrase. All right. Or non-essential clause. So then I would put commas around it. Okay, but notice that I also changed the to this book, because, in a sentence like that, I do need something in there to specify which book I'm talking about. All right. If I could add the title of the book. Okay, the book Leaves of Grass, which I borrowed from you, is excellent. Okay, that would be a case where we would have commas. But sometimes you have a clause or a phrase that does not, or just a word and you don't have which or that to let us know whether it's essential. And sometimes it depends on the meaning of the sentence. Okay. Um, okay. The students who are lazy will not learn anything. Okay. I could write that sentence with commas around who are lazy, and I can write it without commas around who are lazy, but the meaning changes. Okay. So if I say the students, comma, who are lazy, comma, will not learn anything, then I'm saying that I can take out the clause who are lazy without changing the meaning of the sentence, without changing the meaning of the main point I'm trying to make, which in that case would be the students will not learn anything. All right. So I'm essentially talking about all the students, right? I'm not specifying a certain group of students in my class. Okay. Whereas if I say the students who are lazy will not learning anything without commas, then I'm saying that this information is essential to my main point. I cannot take it out without changing the point I'm trying to make. So in the second sentence, what I'm saying is that only the students who are lazy will not learn anything. All right. And I'm not saying anything about any of the other students. Whereas in the first sentence, I'm implying that all the students who are lazy, or sorry, that all the students are lazy, and that all the students will not learn anything. All right. So, in the first sentence, I'm kind of a mean teacher. In the second sentence, I'm, uh, you know, less mean, um, or maybe just more of a realistic teacher. Um, but the meaning changes. All right. So the essential question that you want to ask yourself, right, if you don't have the words that or which to guide you, is can I take this part out of the sentence without losing any meaning in the main idea? Okay. And if I can take it out, then I'm going to put commas around it. If I cannot take it out, then I won't put commas around it. Okay. The one exception to this, prepositional phrases, for example, are typically considered essential. So I'm not going to put commas around a prepositional phrase unless it's at the beginning of the sentence as an introductory element. All right. So, so I have an exercise here, 10 sentences. And if you would like to do the exercise, pause the video now and do the exercise. And then when you're done, hit play, and I will go over the answers. Okay, so I'm going to switch to the next slide now that has the answers to this exercise. And what you're doing, maybe I should say, what you're doing in this exercise is you're trying to decide whether any of these sentences need commas. Some of them do need commas, some of them don't need commas. All right, so not all the sentences need commas. Okay, and some sentences will need more than one comma. Okay, so I'm going to go to the answer slide now. Okay, so in the first sentence, Patterson Tower, the recently completed office building, is a monument to concrete ugliness. So I'm putting commas around the recently completed office building, okay, because that is not essential to the main point, okay. And it also, it interrupts the flow of the sentence. So if I take that out of the sentence, I have Patterson Power as a monument to concrete ugliness. All right. That's the point I'm trying to make. I don't need that other information to make that point. Okay. Now, it's not that that information is useless or irrelevant. It's just that it's not essential. Okay. Number two, the movie that I wanted to see is no longer playing. So in this case, I'm not going to add any comments. This sentence is correct. Okay. Um, the clause that I wanted to see, all right, is essential because I'm using that information to specify which movie is no longer playing. All right. It also begins with that. And as we know, a clause that begins with that is going to be essential, whereas a clause that begins with which is not going to be essential. Okay. Uh, so two is correct. Three, each person who enters the contest must send 2 box tops. This one is also correct. Okay, a clause that begins with who might be essential, it might be non-essential, but in this case, um, it's clearly essential because if I take it out, I'm saying each person must send in 2 box tops. Of course, the only people who are going to send in box tops are the people who enter the contest. Okay, so if you don't enter the contest, you don't need to send anything. So that is essential, no commas. Number 4, John decided nonetheless to buy the car. So in this case, we have a word nonetheless that's there for emphasis, but it's not essential, so we're going to put commas around it. Number 5, the Mississippi River, which once flowed into Hudson Bay, flows south into the Gulf of Mexico. So here, which flowed north into Hudson Bay is not essential. We can take it out and still keep the meaning of the sentence or the meaning of the main idea. It begins with which is another clue that it's not essential. So we're going to put commas before and after that clause. Okay, so comma before which, comma after Bay. Number 6, your cat, watching the dog intently, walked carefully away. Okay, so this one, watching the dog intently, is not essential to the main idea of the sentence, which is the cat walked carefully away. Again, it's relevant. It helps us understand why the cat walked carefully, but we can take it out and the main idea is still there. So we're going to put comma before watching, comma after intently. Whereas 7, which is a very similar sentence, the cat that was watching the dog intently walked carefully away. Okay, that is going to be correct, no commas. The word that is our clue that there's no commas. And the reason why this is essential here is that I'm using that was watching the dog intently to clarify which cat I'm talking about. All right. Number 8, TV commercials. Sometimes the most entertaining parts of a program are essentially flashy corporate propaganda. So sometimes the most entertaining parts of a program is not essential. If I take it out, the sentence reads, TV commercials are essentially flashy corporate propaganda. That's my main idea. So this is not essential to the main idea. So I'm going to put commas around it. Comma before sometimes, comma after program. Number 9, the dam project, which many in the government consider to be a sign of national strength, will destroy hundreds of villages and vast areas of wildlife habitat along the riverbanks. So here, we have the word which is our clue that that this is not an essential clause. So we're going to put a comma before which, comma after strength. This is the part that we can take out of the sentence, and the main idea is still intact. And then the last one, Sun Ra, the free jazz musician, claimed to be from Saturn. So in this one, the free jazz musician is not essential to the main idea of the sentence, so we're going to have a comma before the and a comma after musician. Okay. All right. So moving on. Okay, we're going to go through a few more rules, and I'm going to do another exercise. This rule is also a little complicated, though it's also a lot more rare than the essential and non-essential element rule. And this is when you have 2 adjectives that come before a noun. All right. So if the adjectives are considered coordinate, then you put a comma between them. Okay. If they're non-coordinate, then you do not put a comma. So what does that mean? Well, if they're coordinate adjectives, then it doesn't matter which order they are in. It also doesn't matter whether we separate them with a word like and. So these are the questions you want to ask. Does the sentence make sense if the adjectives are written in reverse order? Does the sentence make sense if the adjectives are written with the word and between them? So if you answer yes to these questions, then separate these adjectives with a comma. Okay. So here's an example of a coordinate adjective. He's a difficult, stubborn child. All right. So I could say he was a stubborn, difficult child. I could also say he was a difficult and stubborn child. All right. All that makes sense. So it doesn't matter what the order is. It doesn't matter whether I put and in between them. So that would be a case where I would put a comma between difficult and stubborn. All right. So let me give you some examples of non-coordinate adjectives, because those are the ones that that can be a little difficult to identify sometimes. They lived in a white frame house. Okay. So in this case, you know, if I switch them around, they live in a frame white house. It doesn't really work because, um, because white is really sort of describing a kind of frame, and frame is kind of describing the house. So the order actually matters, okay, because it's telling us what color the frames are, and the frame is telling us what kind of a house it is. Okay, so when adjectives are sort of specifying a certain type, then they're going to be considered non-coordinate. So like if I said, they lived in a white and frame house, that also doesn't really make sense. Um, because the color white is, describing, not just describing the house, but it's also describing the framing that's being used. Um, so those would be considered non-coordinate. All right. So a lot of times colors and adjectives that specify a certain type, okay, are in situations where we would not use commas. Okay. Um, Another example, they opened the big bread box. Okay, so this is another non-coordinate adjective because the bread box is a type of box. All right, so we would not want to move bread away from the word box. We would not want to say that's a bread big box. Okay, it sounds kind of silly. We also wouldn't want to say that's a big and bread box. Okay, because these adjectives are not describing the box equally. Okay, one is describing the size of the box, the other one is describing the type of box. All right, so in a way, they're in different categories of description. So those are non-coordinate adjectives. Um, Adjective pairs that involve numbers are also typically non-coordinate. So if I bought 2 red shirts, all right, then I would not put a comma because I would not say I bought red 2 shirts. All right, that doesn't really make sense. Or 2 and red shirts. Um, so so if you have a case where one of the adjectives is a number, in this case, one of the adjectives is also a color. Usually with colors, we are not going to have commas either. But I could also say 2 big shirts. Okay, I wouldn't say 2 and big shirts. So that's a non-coordinate adjective. So cases where one of the adjectives is specifying a certain type of something as opposed to just describing it, um, or cases where or one of the adjectives is a color, cases where one of the adjectives is a number. Those are typically where you are not going to put a comma between the two adjectives. And this is only really an issue when you have the adjectives before the noun. All right, and there's more than one. Okay, so that's a little confusing, I know. Again, you don't come across it very often, but it's a good rule to be familiar with. Um, and then these rules are also rules that you don't come across often. Use a comma near the end of the sentence to separate contrasted coordinate elements or to indicate a pause or shift. Like if I say the chimpanzee seemed reflective, almost human. There's kind of a shift in thought there, where again, in this case, I'm also using sort of two descriptions for the chimpanzee, but they're coming after the verb, right? So in a way, I could say the chimpanzee seemed reflective, the chimpanzee seemed almost human, um, but I'm just combining those two ideas. Okay, and then number 7, use commas to set off phrases at the end of the sentence that refer back to the beginning or middle of the sentence. All right. So like for example, Nancy waved enthusiastically at the docking ship, comma, laughing joyously. So gerund phrases, phrases that begin with an ing word, are typically the ones where you see this the most. And and you're going to use this because um, you're going to use this in cases where it has the same subject as the main subject of the verb, like Nancy waved and she laughed joyously, or we could say she waved, comma, laughing joyously. Okay, but you want to make sure if you're doing when you're doing something like this that you're not um, there's no confusion about who's doing the laughing. So in the second sentence, Lisa waved at Nancy, laughing joyously. Um, it could be a little confusing about who is doing the laughing. So, so if Lisa's laughing, then, you want to put laughing joyously at the beginning of the sentence. Okay. Laughing joyously, Lisa waved at Nancy. Now, if Nancy's doing the laughing, then you need a word that makes that more clear. Like, uh, Lisa waved at Nancy, who laughed joyously. Okay. So then that who, because it comes after Nancy, makes it clear that it's Nancy who's doing the laughing. Um, all right. And then three more rules for when to use commas. Um, Geographical names, items, and dates and addresses. Um, the rule here that people most often get confused about is that the if you have a date like July 22nd, 1959, and it's not at the end of the sentence, then you should also have a comma after the year. All right. So July 22nd, comma, 1959, comma. Same thing if you had a state in the middle of the sentence. So the state's not at the end. So like here, um, uh, the so here you have Washington D.C. And in this case, I'm noticing that I don't have the periods after DC, um, which typically you do, but that's not really a comma issue. But you do have there is a comma between Washington and DC when you write Washington, DC. All right. But if this were in the middle of the sentence, okay. Um, so if I said, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, comma, Washington, comma, DC, comma, is the location of the White House, right? Then you would have a comma after DC. So if there's a state, then you do, and if there's part of an address that ends in a state, you do put a comma at the end of the state if it's in the middle of the sentence. All right. Quotation marks. Okay, so if you have if you're introducing a quotation mark, okay, then you typically do that with a comma. The one exception is if you're introducing it with an independent clause. So in other words, everything before the quotation could be a complete sentence. Then it would be a colon, and we'll cover that later. But John said without emotion, that cannot be a complete sentence. So comma, I'll see you tomorrow. Sometimes you interrupt the quotation with clarification of who's talking. I was able, comma, she answered, comma, to complete the assignment. Now, one other rule I want to point out to you here is that commas always come before quotation marks, never after quotation marks. Okay, so like I was able, comma, quotation mark. All right, she answered, comma, quotation mark. The comma is always before the quotation mark. So you're never going to have a comma that comes after a quotation mark. Okay. Periods are also typically before quotation marks unless you have a citation that comes after the quotation mark. And again, that's something else that we'll cover later on when we do citations. All right. Um, and then, use commas wherever necessary to prevent possible confusion or misreading. So if you have a situation um, where there might be confusion about, in this case, whether George and Harrison are two people or one person whose first name is George and last name is Harrison, then you want to, you know, you want to use a comma here to make sure that you don't have that confusion. They're not potential misreading. So, one of the goals in writing, and especially when you're thinking about how to use punctuation, is, you want the reader to be able to read the sentence and understand the sentence the first time they read it, right? Um, and so if part of the sentence is confusing, then they might have to go back and reread the sentence to figure it out. And that's something that you want to avoid. Okay, so situations where you don't use commas. Okay. Um, so I have a few of these, and these are just good guidelines to help you avoid using a comma where you should not use a comma. Um, don't use a single comma to separate the subject from the verb. So this is one that I see all the time. So if I say an 18-year-old in California is now considered an adult, all right, 18-year-old is the subject, is the verb, okay? So we're never going to have one subject that comes between the subject and the verb. Or sorry, we're never going to have one comma that comes between the subject and the verb. Okay? You might have two commas that come between the subject and the verb, okay? Um, but you're never going to have just one comma that separates your subject and verb, okay? Same thing, the most important attribute of a ball player, comma, is quick reflex action. That comma should not be there. So both those sentences should be written without a comma, right? Um, don't put a comma between two verbs or verb phrases in a compound predicate. Okay, we laid out our music at snacks and began to study. All right, so we have one verb is laid, the other verb is began. So if there's only two verbs or verb phrases, then you're not going to have a comma before the and. All right, so don't confuse a sentence like this with a compound sentence where you have two independent clauses, where there's two subject-verb pairs. Okay, same thing. I turned the corner and ran smack into the patrol car. Um, so no comma before that and, because I'm only doing two things. Now, if I'm doing three things, then yes, that now it's a list of three. I turned the corner, stepped on the gas, and ran smack into a patrol car. Now I'm doing three things. And again, this is not a compound sentence because if I take out the comma and, I don't have two sentences, right? Ran smack into a patrol car is not a complete sentence, okay? Same thing goes with nouns, okay? Don't put a comma between two nouns, noun phrases, or noun clauses in a compound subject or object. So the music teacher from your high school and the football coach from mine are married. Only two people here, so no comma before the end, all right? Jeff told me that the job was still available and that the manager wanted to interview me. So in this case, Jeff told me two things, so no comma before the and. All right. The only time we have a comma before the and is if it's a compound sentence, meaning we can separate it into two sentences, or it's a list of three or more items. Okay. And then lastly, don't put a comma after the main clause when a dependent clause follows it. All right. So the cat scratched at the door while I was eating should not have a comma. Now, if I put the while I was eating before the cat, then yes, I do need a comma. Okay. Um, I see this a lot with because. Okay, so it's a good rule of thumb that uh, typically you are not going to put a comma before because. All right. If you do put a comma before because, it's because there's a comma there for some other reason, like maybe there's a non-essential element. But you should not put a comma just because you have the word because in a sentence. All right. Typically, no comma before because. Um, the one exception to this last don't one is if it's you're showing contrast. She was still quite upset, although she had won the Oscar. Okay, so we would not expect her to be upset. So there's contrast here. So with contrast, if you want to emphasize the contrast, then you can do that with a comma. All right. Okay, so one more exercise with commas. Correct any commas errors in the following sentences. If the sentence is correct, write C. So some of these are correct. And if you would like to do this exercise, then pause the video and do the exercise. And now I will go to the next slide and go over the answers. All right. So we all piled into Sadiq's car, which we affectionately refer to as the blue mongoose. So comma before which, non-essential element, we know because it begins with which. Because the non-essential clause ends the sentence, then we only need one comma, okay? Because at the end of the sentence, we just put a period. 2, when air conditioning arrived in the workplace, it had a large, measurable impact on productivity. So here we're adding 2 commas, okay, for different reasons. Okay, the first comma is because we have an introductory element, an introductory clause. When air conditioning arrived in the workplace, okay. So that comma is letting us know that our introductory clause is ending and our main clause is beginning. Large measurable impact. Okay, we need commas between those 2 adjectives because they are coordinate. Okay, I could say that had a measurable large impact or a large and measurable impact. So those are coordinate adjectives. So we're going to put a comma between them. Okay. Number 3 is correct. Okay, so with a date, you have a comma after the date and after the year. All right. And then financial aid applications. So financial aids, these, you're not going to have a comma between financial aid. Those are not coordinate adjectives, okay? Because they're a specific type of application. Number 4, you do have a comma before however and after however, because that's a non-essential word. We can take it out and the main sentence remains intact. Now you might point out, well, this sentence has the word that, okay, and you told me not to put a comma before the word that, okay, and this is part of the reason why commas can be a little confusing, is that yes, typically you do not put a comma before that, but in some cases you might, because you might need a comma for another reason, okay, and we do need a comma after however, right? So the comma is there not because of the word that, but because of the word however. The word however is non-essential, so we need a comma before it and after it. All right, number 5, yes, Ronald, it really is time for bed, comma, said the weary, impatient mother. So typically, well, not typically, anytime you say the name of a person that you're talking to, that's going to be considered a non-essential element, okay? We could put a comma before Ronald, okay, but in this case, the yes comma, the yes Ronald, we're just identifying that as sort of the introductory element. Because it's a short sentence, again, adding too many commas sometimes, especially in a short sentence, can be confusing. But we do need a comma after bed. All right. Okay, because we're going from the quotation to the rest of the sentence. Comma is always before the quotation mark. And then we also need a comma after weary, because weary, we could say weary and impatient. We could say the impatient, weary mother. So those are coordinate adjectives. We need a comma between them. All right. Let's see. Number 6, we need commas, a comma before simply and after stool, because that's a non-essential phrase. Okay. So we can take that out of the sentence. Duchamp's bicycle wheel demonstrates that an everyday object can have beauty of its own. All right. That's our main idea. So this part is not essential. We want commas around. Number 7 is correct. We do want a comma after concerts because that is an introductory phrase. Okay, so that comma lets us know that the main idea is about to begin. And number 8, we're going to take out the comma between database and, all right? Because Louise only did two things. If she does two things, no comma. She typed the names and printed out the decorative mailing labels, all right? So no comma there. Um, but we do have a comma after labels, all right? Because this is a really long introductory clause. The main idea is I folded and stapled all the flyers. All right, that's our independent clause. This first part is a dependent clause because it begins with while. I could not, for example, put a period after labels. Okay. And then one other thing I wanted to point out, decorative mailing labels, right? That would be an example of a non-coordinate adjective pair. So no comma between decorative and mailing labels because a mailing label is a type of label. All right. So it wouldn't make sense to say print out mailing decorative labels or decorative and mailing labels. All right. Because we're talking about a type of label. All right. So that is it for commas. Okay. I want to go over apostrophes and capitalization, but this is not going to take as long. So we are getting, somewhat close to the end of the video. Okay, the commas is the long part because there's just a lot of different rules for when you use commas and a few rules for when you should never use commas. But apostrophes, it's there's really only a few rules you need to know, but apostrophes can be confusing. All right. Um, so usually use apostrophes with possessives, okay, to show ownership. All right. And there's really one rule you need to know, but it is kind of a confusing rule. And the rule is this: add apostrophe s to the end of the noun unless the noun is plural and already ends in s. All right. So we use apostrophes to make a noun possessive. Uh, we're going to add apostrophe s to the end unless the noun is plural and already ends in s. It has to be both. Okay. So let me show you some examples. In the slide here, just don't pay attention to these weird pictures here. On the original PowerPoint, they were arrows, but they did not convert when I, added the PowerPoint to this program. So just think of these as arrows. Okay. So if I take the word boss, okay, boss is singular and it ends in s. All right. So unless the noun is plural and already ends in s, well, it's not plural. So this rule does not apply. We're always going to add apostrophe s to make boss possessive. So if I'm going to say the boss's office, I'm going to add apostrophe s because it's singular. Okay. If it's singular, it's always apostrophe s. Okay. Children. Okay. So now children is plural, but it does not already end in s. Children is one of the rare plural nouns that does not end in s. So that's also going to be apostrophe s because it doesn't follow both of these rules. Okay, it has to be both. So if I say the children's games, that's going to be apostrophe s. Okay, because it's plural, but it does not end in s. Okay, so this does not apply. Okay, adult. Okay, singular. Okay, so if it's singular, it's always going to be apostrophe s. So adult's job. But adults, okay, if I say there are 3 adults, okay, that is a noun that's plural and it already ends in s. And when I say it already ends in s, I mean whether it's possessive or not, there is going to be an s. Okay, so the noun is plural, it already ends in s. Both of these rules apply, or both of these conditions apply. So in this case, we just add an apostrophe. So adults, apostrophe, careers. Okay. Bosses is another one. So if I have 3 bosses, okay, then it's plural and it already ends in s, meaning that even if it weren't possessive, it still would have the s at the end. So in this case, we're just going to add an apostrophe. The boss's convention. All right. Notice how bosses and bosses, whether it's singular or plural, the singular possessive and plural possessive sound exactly the same. Okay. Also notice how the singular possessive bosses sounds the exact same as the plural non-possessive bosses. Okay. So, so this is why it's easy to get a little confused. Um, One way to also think about it is that, if we're adding apostrophe S, we're always adding a sound to the word. All right. So boss becomes bosses. We've added that extra S sound. Children becomes children's. We've added an extra S sound. Adult becomes adults. We've added an extra S sound. But there's no difference between the plural adults and the possessive adults in terms of sound. We didn't add a sound to make plural adults possessive. We didn't add a sound to the plural bosses to make bosses possessive when we said the boss's convention. Okay, well, so when we're not adding that extra S sound to the word, we're just adding the apostrophe. Okay. All right. Um, Possessive pronouns never have apostrophes. Okay, and this is another area of potential confusion. Um, so a possessive pronoun would be like its, my, his, her, their. Possessive pronouns never have apostrophes. Okay, um, you know, if I say that the the squirrel chased its tail, okay, its in that case is possessive. Its tail. So, but it's a pronoun, so no apostrophe. Okay, just like you wouldn't have apostrophe after my. Okay, like um, if I gave you my hat, no apostrophe. There sometimes throws people off because there are different forms of there are different words that sound like there. Okay, and some of them have apostrophes. Okay, but there as a possessive pronoun is never going to have an apostrophe. Okay, so if I gave the students their papers, no apostrophe because that's a possessive pronoun. All right. The only time you are going to have an apostrophe with a pronoun is if it's a contraction. Okay, so like it's apostrophe s always means it is. Okay, when there has an apostrophe, that always means they are. Okay, one way to avoid this confusion in your own writing, or avoid making this mistake in your own writing, is to just don't use contractions. In formal writing, it's the um, you generally avoid contractions. Okay, um, and especially contractions involving pronouns. Okay, so just write out it is. Just write out they are. Just write out will not. Okay, and then you won't have to worry about the apostrophe issue. Like you're really never obligated to use a contraction in writing. Okay, and in formal writing, you're discouraged from doing it. So just don't do it, and then you don't have to worry about putting the apostrophe in the wrong place. Okay, um, and then don't use an apostrophe to make a number or letter plural. So we don't use apostrophes to make things plural. All right. So if I talk about the 1980s, I don't put an apostrophe between 80 and the S. Okay. Or if I say I got 3 B's on my report card, I don't put an apostrophe between the B and the S. So that's another mistake that people often make. So you will see that a lot where people will want to put that apostrophe there, like maybe in like an ad, um, or in a commercial or something like that. But technically, it shouldn't be there. Technically, we don't use apostrophes to make things plural, only to make them either possessive or to form contractions. Okay, and the apostrophe in a contraction always specifies where the letter has been taken out. So that's why it won't in apostrophe T, it's because we've taken out the O. even though, technically, we've we've taken out other letters from will, but I'm not going into that. Contractions that end in NT, because of not, the apostrophe is always between the N and the T. And again, you could just write out will not. In formal writing, that's preferred. Okay, so I have one more exercise, and then I'm going to cover just some capitalization, a few capitalization things, then I'm going to wrap up. So again, if you want to do this exercise, what you're doing here is you are um, trying to decide if any of these sentences need apostrophes, and if so, putting the apostrophe in there. And actually, all of them, I believe, need apostrophes. So find where there should be apostrophes and add those apostrophes to the words in the sentence. If you want to do that exercise, pause it now, because I am going to now go over the answers. And it looks like I did not add an answer slide to this one, unfortunately. So you're just going to have to listen to me and imagine the answers. So number one, who is the party's candidate for vice president this year? So parties should have an apostrophe before the S, okay, because that's a singular, okay? It's a singular, party is a singular noun, okay? And we know it's because the plural IES. So it's singular, it does have sense as a plural. So that's singular, so singular is always going to be apostrophe S. Okay, and it's possessive because we're talking about the candidate of the party. The fox had its right leg caught securely in the trap's jaws. So that first it's, no apostrophe there, all right, because it's a pronoun. Possessive pronouns do not have apostrophes, and we're not saying it is. The fox had it is right foreleg doesn't make sense. But traps should have an apostrophe. It's singular because it doesn't make sense the leg would be caught in more than one trap. So it's apostrophe S. All right. Number three, our neighbor's car is an old Chrysler, and it's just about to fall apart. Now, neighbors, depending on whether, uh, you know, if it's one neighbor, it's going to be apostrophe S. But if you have more, if you're talking about more than one neighbor who owns the car, like if it's a family, then you could actually have the apostrophe after the S. It depends on whether neighbor is singular or plural, whether you talk one person owns the car or more than one person owns the car. Okay, if it's plural, the plural neighbors already ends in S, so the apostrophe would be after the S. But it's that we're saying it is just about to fall apart, so that's a contraction. It should have an apostrophe. All right. In 3 weeks' time, we will have to begin school again. There should be an apostrophe after the S in weeks because weeks is plural and it already ends in S. So apostrophe after the S. Didn't you hear that they are leaving tomorrow? So here we have a contraction, didn't. So the apostrophe should be between the N and the T. All right. Again, you don't have to, well, okay. Let me back up for a second. This would be the case. This would be a case where it might be more awkward than not to not use a contraction. I mean, you could say, did you not hear that they are leaving tomorrow? Okay. And that would be the way to do it without a contraction. But this isn't the kind of question you would really ask in an essay anyway. But if you felt the urge to change they are to their, they apostrophe re, resist that urge. No reason to. They are leaving tomorrow is fine. Again, in formal writing, it's better to write things out than to try to form contractions. Okay. 6, the moon's rays shone feebly on the path, and I heard the insect chirping. So here we need two apostrophes because we have two possessives. The moon, there's only one moon because I'm assuming we're on planet Earth. So there's only one moon, so that is singular. So that's always going to be apostrophe s. Okay, but insects, um, you know, we're outside, so we're assuming there's more than one insect. All right, so insects is plural, and uh, so um, it's plural, so insects already ends in s, so apostrophe after the s. All right. 7, she did not hear her children's cries. Children is plural, but it does not already end in s. Okay. Now I say, well, it ends in s here, and that would say, well, that's because it's possessive. Okay. But if it weren't possessive, it would not have an s. So, um, so the apostrophe should be before the s. It's children apostrophe s, because the word children does not end in s when it's not possessive. Okay. And then 8, my address has 3 sevens. Tim's phone number has 4 twos. So no apostrophes with sevens or twos because those are plural, but we do need an apostrophe after Tim. Okay, Tim is singular, so Tim apostrophe s. All right. Um, one thing I'll add about names, just really quickly, and it's kind of a confusing and annoying exception. Proper names, like if I have a name Charles that ends in S, it's acceptable to just put an apostrophe. It's also acceptable to put apostrophe S. Um, you know, so uh, for me, you could do it either way. Like, just the apostrophe with a proper name that ends in S is more common, actually, even though logically it doesn't follow the rule. Um, But yeah, so that is one exception with a proper name that ends in S. You can just put an apostrophe after it, even though it's singular. All right. So, so I want to wrap up. I know this video is running a little bit long. Um, so with capitalization, I'm not going to go over a capitalization exercise. All right. There's a lot of capitalization rules. Most of them you know or you should know, even if you don't always uh, proofread sure you're following them. Like capitalize the first word of a sentence. Capitalize I if you're referring to yourself. Um, I see those mistakes all the time, but I assume that there are issues where you're just not proofreading or typing quickly and not proofreading. So, so here are things that often do seem to legitimately confuse people. Titles. Okay, so title, so a title of a book, a movie, a song, etc. Okay, here's the rule. We always capitalize the first word of a title. We always capitalize the last word of the title. We always capitalize the first word after colon if there's a colon in the title. And then we capitalize all the important words, all the other important words, which basically means every other word that's not a preposition, conjunction, or article. Okay, and an article would be a and the, but, and. Well, and would be a conjunction. So, um, uh, and there's a lot of prepositions. Conjunctions. Just think about like the fanboys. The fanboys we're not going to capitalize unless it's the first word, last word, or first word after um, a colon. All right. So here's some examples. A series of unfortunate events. All right. That's the title of the book series. We capitalize the A because the first word. We capitalize of because it's a preposition. All right. Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Okay. Um, so we capitalize the first word and last word. We would capitalize them anyway. We don't capitalize and because that's a conjunction. We don't capitalize the because that's an article. Okay. A is also an article. It's the first word of that title. So we're not going to capitalize it there. Explore a book, colon, a Kids Science Museum and book. So here we capitalize the first word and last word always. We also capitalize the first word after a colon. So A comes after a colon, so that's capitalized. But in a book, in is a preposition, A is an article. Okay, so the A here is not capitalized because it doesn't come after a colon. Okay, so unless an article is the first word in the title, like A series, or the first word after a colon, we're not going to capitalize it. Okay. Um, Now, when it comes to school classes and subjects, I make this mistake a lot too. But technically, we only capitalize a subject in school if it is the name of a class or if it's a word that's always capitalized. Like, for example, English or Spanish, because they're languages, so they're always capitalized. All right. Or if I was studying Russian history, I would always capitalize Russian, but I wouldn't capitalize history. Okay. But if we're talking about a specific class, that's when we do capitalize it. So I would say I am taking geography this semester, no capitalization for geography, okay, because I'm talking about the subject. But if I say I'm taking geography 101 this semester, now I'm giving you the name of the class, and so because it's a name, I capitalize geography. All right. Now, now with professional titles, kinship titles, it's the same basic idea. If it's part of a name, we capitalize it. We don't capitalize it if it's not part of a name. So if I say my aunt is a doctor, I don't capitalize aunt. I don't capitalize doctor. All right. But if I use it with their name, those titles with their name, I do capitalize them. My aunt Christine practices medicine. All right. So now we capitalize aunt because it comes before her name, Aunt Christine. And same thing with Dr. Menendez. Okay, so the doctor here is capitalized and abbreviated. Um, and it comes before, because it comes before the name. All right. So, and then, in general, proper nouns, if you have trouble clarifying whether something's a proper noun, not a proper noun, you could look it up. All right. And that can help you decide, and listen, I mean, with some of these rules, like I Google them. If I ever, I'm writing something and I come across a word, I'm like, wait, is that capitalized? Or even if I'm, like, wait, is that how it's spelled? It's, um, sometimes whether it's just because I'm not familiar with the word or I'm just tired, sometimes I forget too. So I just Google it. And you can find based on the usage whether it's something that should be capitalized. But generally, proper nouns specify names and not types, right? So house is a type; it's a type of building. But White House is a name, right? We're referring to the name of a specific house. Okay. So pine tree is a type of tree that's not capitalized, but giving tree, okay, like if, like in the book, there's a tree called the giving tree. So I would capitalize that if I'm just referring to, a specific name for a tree. All right. Um, okay, so that's it for the video on grammar. I'm going to be doing another video that talks about the narrative essay and the outline and the essay that I posted, the example essay I posted this week. Um, so be on the lookout for that. But don't forget to complete your grammar exercises and submit those to Blackboard. And don't forget to do your quizzes and get your quizzes done by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. All right. Thank you.